So I'm out walking today, and about an hour and a half ago, 2 hours ago, I got off of a call of a group that I'm a part of called the Speaker Lab. And usually once or twice a week, we have a big group call. One of those is usually kind of a free-for-all Q&A kind of a time. And today, the coach on the call, his name is Jeremy, asked the question, what are some of your wins over the summer as you look back? And as I thought about specifically in the Speaker Lab, what have been some of the wins that I've experienced when it comes to a speaking business and coaching business and stuff like that, there was three ladies that came to my mind that are part of the Speaker Lab. And when I thought about my greatest win, probably the Speaker Lab this summer, has been the community. The men and women who speak encouragement and challenge into my life to help me be the very best that I can be. And I thought about these three ladies that I've had a chance to connect with and kind of talk about who they are, what their story is, what their speaking topic's going to be, and how to be the most effective when they speak. Their names are Lindsay, Lisa, and Christy. And you know what? I have learned from each of them a lot over the past summer. Had an opportunity to speak at an event that Lisa put on. I really focused in on taking personal responsibility in the culture that you find yourself. But one of the things that Lisa taught me through the process of working with her and with everybody else in the conference that she put on, she said this: it's time to put the human back in HR. You know what? I think a lot of times that's what happens in organizations and culture, is we become so focused on a process, on an outcome, on a product, that we forget that there's people in an organization. Second is a lady named Lindsay. Lindsay had an opportunity, I had an opportunity to sit down with her through Zoom and kind of hear her story. And one of the things that she taught me is why do we get surprised when God acts like God in our lives? And then lastly is Christy. She and I have connected up through Speaker Lab the past few months, and she's got an speaking engagement coming up this end of this month. And so she sent me a copy of her speech. And I got to tell you, man, she's doing an incredible job. She is going to give that speech this week, or in 2 weeks. And one of the things is I got a chance to read her speech. One of the big takeaways for me is her thought is this, is how to put the twinkle back in your star when the stars are covered up with a bunch of storm clouds. And she shares a story of an experience in her life. Now, what I want to do is over the next 3 walk and talk videos, I kind of want to unpack those 3 thoughts from those ladies. Putting the human back in HR. Why are we surprised when God acts like God? And how to put the twinkle back in your star. And you know what I learned through this whole process is that your story, my story, everybody has a story. And we can both be encouraged, challenged, and ultimately become better men and women if we will allow ourselves to hear other people's stories, learn from that, and let it impact our story. So the next 3 days, we're going to be looking at what Lisa, what Lindsay, and what Christy have taught me. And hopefully you're going to be encouraged by that as well. As I always say, if you want to hike the mountain, you do it one step at a time. And I've said this so often. You know what? It's a whole lot easier to hike that mountain when you got somebody else hiking with you. And so, hey, the next couple of days, tune in and let's hike the mountain together. Hike on, my friends. So I'm out walking today, and I wanted to continue a thought I started a couple days ago about some lessons that I have learned this summer, specifically from 3 ladies that I've connected up with through a group called the Speaker Lab. And the first is Lisa Perez had a chance to speak at her event a couple weeks ago, kind of a national management summit, and got to speak to a large group of HR people. And one of the things that Lisa really drove home in that conference was about putting the human back in HR. And when I think about that, one of the things that Lisa really mentioned was too often what happens in the HR department in organizations is HR gets more concerned with processes, with procedures, and focusing on the stuff that people do instead of focusing on the people that do the stuff. And that really kind of hit home with me. What does it look like, not just for me to put the human back in HR, but what does it mean for me to put back the human in all human relationships that I have? Too often I think I view people as what can I get from them or get out of them. Too often we view relationships as what's in it for me instead of what's best for other people. So as Lisa taught me, put human back into HR, I was challenged to put that human relationship back in all relationships that I have. So as I think about that, what does that look like for me? That means this: I'm going to stop and I'm going to listen before I speak. That means I'm going to look at things from other people's perspective before I look at it from my own perspective. That means this, that I'm going to ask the question, what it says in the Bible, the golden rule is still true today, is that I want to treat people the way that I want to be treated. So think about your relationships, those relationships you have with other people. How can you begin to put the human back in those relationships? How can you begin to listen? How can you begin to see things from their perspective? And how can you start with the thought of how can I add value to them instead of how can they be valuable to me? So I always say, if you want to hike the mountain, you do it one step at a time. And if we want to take those great steps in other people's lives, we've got to stop looking at them, at what we can get out of them, and we've got to start looking at them as a human being and find ways to connect with them. Hike on, my friends. So I'm out walking this afternoon in Fayetteville, Georgia. Came up to see my wife as she's on a work project, and had a couple hours now, and while she's at work, that I wanted to go out and get some steps in. And I want to continue a thought of 3 things that I've learned this summer from a group at the Speaker Lab that I'm a part of. I shared first about, from Lisa Perez, something that she taught me about putting the human back into HR and what that looks like. Today I want to share a thought that I learned from Lindsay. Lindsay challenged me with this big idea of, why are we so surprised when God acts like God in our lives? I think about that for myself. There's so many times in my life where I face difficulty, I face obstacles, I face circumstances that I'm not sure how I'm going to get through it. And honestly, I'm reminded that in my own strength and power, I can't. But those are the moments that God always shows up and does something not just in my situation incredible, but he always starts first by doing something in my life incredible first. Lindsay shared a story of some things that she went through in the period of 12 months. The murder of an ex-husband that she actually witnessed while she was on the phone with him. The health scare of a sister. The loss of life savings through a scam. And then a diagnosis of cancer. And through all of that, she says, you know what? Every one of those terrible situations, God was always there. Too often I think what we do is we get so focused on the circumstance, we get so focused on how we feel, we get so focused on what we lose, we get so focused on the discouragement, but the reason we are surprised by God is because we've got our eyes off of Him. I go back to the story when it was a stormy evening and the disciples were out on the boat, and then all of a sudden they look off in the distance. In the midst of this incredible storm, they look off in the distance, and there's this dude walking on the water. And they all look around and they go, man, it must be a ghost. Finally, they look closer and they realize, is that Jesus? Jesus is out there walking on the water. And Peter, gosh, I love Peter. I identify with him. Captain Impulse. He goes, Jesus, if that's you, tell me to come towards you and I'll walk on the water and meet you there. And Jesus says, come on, Peter. And so Peter gets out of the boat. I'm telling you, what an incredible step of faith that first step out of the boat must have been for Peter. As he steps off the boat on top of the water and his foot doesn't sink. And then one step, and he's getting really close to Jesus. But then he does what you and I do in our life so often. He turns his eyes off of Jesus. And what does he do? He begins to look at the waves. He begins to feel the wind. He sees the rain coming down. He hears the thunder and watches the lightning crackle. And all of a sudden now he gets his eyes off of Jesus and he begins to sink. And then one of the things that we can learn from Peter is this. Listen, we all are going to get our eyes off of Jesus from time to time. But the important thing that Peter did is that when he started to sink, he didn't try to tread water himself. He called out, he shouted desperation toward Jesus. Jesus, save me. And what I love is Jesus' response. Jesus didn't teach a class on 3 happy hops of walking on water. He didn't lecture Peter on the types of mistakes that he made. What Jesus did is he came over to Peter, he reached his hand down, and he lifted him up. What an incredible experience. Listen to me. I always say if you're going to hike the mountain, you do it one step at a time. And sometimes on those hikes, storm rages, difficulties come. We experience death and loss. And you know what? Our eyes are going to get off of our destination of where we're going. But we can be like Peter, and we can call out to God out of desperation. And he is always going to be there. So today, no matter where you're at, in the boat, out of the boat, in the storm, sinking in the storm, remember this. We have a God who's not surprised by our circumstances, but we serve a God who can surprise us and be faithful even in our unfaithfulness and our unwillingness to keep our eyes on him. What an incredible promise. Hike on, my friends. So I'm out walking today, and I want to finish up a thought that I started a couple weeks ago, some things that I have learned over the past few months. And there were 3 things that I learned, each from a different lady of a group that I'm connected with called the Speaker Lab. Lisa taught us about putting the human back in human resources. Lindsay challenged me to think about, why are we surprised when God acts like God? But the third, Christy shared a story with me, and if I was going to put a title to it, her talk is about putting the twinkle back in your star. And how do you do that? How do you find that passion, that want to, that desire, that encouragement that you need when you look up and you see clouds covering up all the quote unquote stars in your life? Well, Christy shared this with me. She shared a story about she and her daughter went to a women's retreat and heard a message from this lady about a tragedy that happened in her family and loss of life and all of that. And Christy said, you know what, don't really need any of that right now. And long story short, she just took a card, say, well, I could share you and your story with some people that may be needing it. Little did she know, in just a couple of days, her life, her family was going to be turned upside down when her son died in a tragic car accident. And Christy talked about what it was like to face the loss of a son and what she learned all through that process, that you know what? The storm clouds of despair, discouragement, uncertainty, anger, all of those that she and her husband and the rest of the family faced during the time of the loss of her son. And she said one night that she was sitting there and she was looking up and the clouds were covering up in a kind of a stormy look. She couldn't see any of the stars. And that was when God reminded her that, you know what? Even when the clouds are there, the stars are there even when you can't see them. And that was kind of her road back. And I think about that in my life and in your life. All of us experience cloudy days. All of us experience stormy nights in our life. When we get that phone call or that text or that email, that in that moment, life changes. And the clouds come over and cover up all of the dreams of the stars, if you will, that we have in our life. So today, I want to remind you, no matter how cloudy, no matter how stormy, the stars are still there. They're behind those clouds. And if we can look beyond those and trust that the stars are still there, you know what? We can find hope in our life that our current situation does not have to define our future. And that sometimes the greatest lessons we can learn in life are the ones that we learn in the midst of those cloudy, stormy nights of life. So I always say, if you want to hike the mountain, you do it one step at a time. Sometimes those steps, clear nights, bright stars, things are great. Some of those steps are tough and difficult because of the cloudy, stormy skies that are in our life. Regardless, one step at a time up the mountain, trust the next step. You don't have to know where you're going to end up. You don't have to know how things are going to work out. You just have to take the next step. So you know what? The way to put the twinkle back in your stars comes with the hope, trust, and knowledge that regardless of the clouds, the stars are still there. Hike on, my friends.